Hello everyone. So today we will be looking at the first chapter and we will be looking at the evolution of psychology. Right? In this chapter we'll be focusing on how psychology emerged as a distinct discipline and what has the discipline's journey been like, right? Now, when we consider the word psychology, right, one of the things that we see is that it is made up of words which have Greek roots, and these are two words really. So the first of these is psych, and the second of these is derived from the Greek word which is logos, right? Now, psych, what it means is the soul, right? And logos literally translates into the study of, right? And so if we combine this, what we get is that psychology is the study of the soul, right? And this is how it was sort of conceived, in the sense that initially psychology was a sub branch of philosophy. Because when we really look at some of the questions that we even study in psychology today, right? Like we, study, for example, we look at, the nature of the mind, right? We look at questions pertaining to the connection between mind and body, right? So all of these questions really, if we just focus on these questions, right, these questions have been pondered over not just by psychologists but by thinkers who lived very, very long ago, right? So even when we have someone like Socrates or Plato and we look at their works, what we see is that they're also discussing what the nature of the mind is. They're also looking at what is the connection between mind and body. They're also concerning themselves with questions such as, how accurate are our perceptions of the world, right? So, and all of these sort of, topics are also discussed within the realm of psychology, right? But, if they were discussing these subjects, does this make them psychologists? So that is the question that we sort of are asking ourselves, right? Well, the answer to that perhaps is not really, right? Because it was not until around 125 to 130 years ago that psychology emerged as a distinct discipline, right? Now, when we looked at all of these different philosophers, right, and all of these different thinkers, right, they were asking some of the questions that are still very pertinent to psychology, but they investigated these questions within their own fields, right? And it was not until this gentleman by the name of Wilhelm Wundt that psychology came to be recognized as a discipline, as a distinct discipline. So you have Wilhelm Wundt here, and Wilhelm Wundt was basically German, right? He was a German physiologist who advocated for psychology to be a discipline in its own right, right? So basically what he did was that he, first of all, delineated psychology's subject matter, right? And he said that psychology ought to be a distinct discipline, right, with its own subject matter. And he believed that the subject matter of psychology is consciousness or conscious experience, right? So conscious experience is, whatever experience that you're conscious of at the moment, that basically constitutes your conscious experience, right? So this is what Wundt believed ought to be the subject matter of conscious experience, right? And it's interesting that he was a physiologist, because this is what we see, that psychology, modern day psychology, right, emerged as this combination between physiology and philosophy. Right? Because you had the works of both, certain physiologists, and ideas taken from both, physiologists and philosophers influencing this new discipline, right? So yes, Wundt believed that psychology ought to be a distinct discipline in its own right. In order to establish it as a distinct discipline, he really advocated for psychology to be a distinct discipline. His contributions include establishing the first lab of psychology, right? Then he also established the first psychology journal. So a journal is basically a publication, right, in which different researchers from around the world send their work, and it is reviewed and then it is published, so that everyone around the world knows what are current ways of thinking, what is current research that is happening in the discipline, right? So for any discipline to sort of exist, having its own journal is something that's very, very important, right? So Wilhelm Wundt made these very, very important contributions to psychology, right? Okay, let's move on and talk slightly more about what his idea of psychology was. So, we've already gone over what he believed to be the subject matter of psychology, and we've said that he believed that it was conscious experience, right? So basically, in Wundt's lab, right, participants would, for example, be shown an apple, right? And they would be asked to describe in great detail what this, image was, what was being presented to them, right? And the basic aim of this exercise, so, this exercise is something that was called introspection, right? Introspection in this sort of context is different from the word introspection that we're used to listen to. So when we think that someone is introspecting, we think that they're looking inward in order to improve themselves or in order to become more self-aware. But here, introspection basically means that they are looking into whatever it is that they're experiencing or their conscious experience. And under Wundt's lab and in Wundt's lab and under his sort of guidance, what they were doing was that they were introspecting in a very, very systematic fashion, right? And the aim of this introspection was to break up the conscious experience into parts, right? To sort of dissect it, right? So Wundt believed that conscious experience can be broken down into different components, and he believed that these components are, for example, different images, different feelings that we might have, different sensations that we have, right? But we won't go into a lot of detail on this. We'll just look at what his idea was. So he was very influenced by what was going on in physiology, because what was happening in, for example, physics is that, matter was being broken down and studied in terms of all of its different components. So you were looking at, what makes up an atom, right? And similar to this vein, right, Wundt was trying to do something similar with conscious experience, right? And it is believed that he wanted to create a periodic table of sorts of the components of conscious experience, right? So this is what his idea was, and there are a lot of different individuals who were extremely influenced by Wundt's way of thinking, right? One of them was Edward Titchener, who later went on to the United States and worked at Cornell University. And, he influenced a lot of other individuals in turn who went on to make some very important contributions, right? So Edward Titchener, when he moved to the United States, the word that he used to describe his movement, which was influenced by Wundt's way of thinking, was structuralism, right? And this is where we're sort of moving away from where psychology was born, which is really, Wundt was a German, right? So we're moving away from Germany, and now we're going towards the United States, right? Now what happened was that Edward Titchener was following, the same sort of way of looking at psychology, in terms of that the subject matter was conscious experience, right? And you were interested in looking at the structure of conscious experience. That's why you have the word structuralism here. So you wanted to look at the structure of conscious experience, right? So, you're doing the same thing. You're trying to break, conscious experience down into different components. So if, for example, you look at this apple, you're asked, what do you see? And the way that respondents usually responded, they were trained to respond in a way that instead of saying, I see an apple, they said, I see redness, I see roundness, right? I see, something that's shiny. So what they were trying to do was that they were trying to break down whatever experience they were having into its different components, right? Through the process of introspection, right? So this is what Titchener was also doing, right? But then along came, another gentleman by the name of William James, right? And William James said that, the structuralists have it all wrong, right? We should not be studying, the structure of conscious experience, because when we're asking people, what do you see when they see an apple, and we're saying, no, don't say that you see an apple. Tell me what you see in terms of, the different components of your conscious experience. So William James believed that these were basically artificial abstractions, that this is not how people experience the world. They do not experience, when you see a tree, for example, you do not say that I see greenness and I see brownness. You say I see a tree, right? So William James believed that conscious experience, right, has a particular flow to it, right? And this is something that he termed the stream of consciousness. Right? And he put forth this idea that we ought not to be looking at the structure of conscious experience, right? Rather, we should be looking at the function of conscious experience. Now, what does this exactly mean? I'll just explain it in a minute. Right, so we have William James here. Now, when William James said that, the subject matter ought not to be structure, rather the function of conscious experience, what do you think he was saying? What is the function of conscious experience? What sense does that make? Right? Now, William James was very much influenced by the writings of Charles Darwin. Right? And Darwin is the individual who put forth the idea of natural selection, or what we know of as his theory regarding the survival of the fittest, right? Now, according to Charles Darwin's theory, right, certain traits or certain biological aspects have what he terms adaptive value, in the sense that having these characteristics, right, what it does is that it helps you adapt to your environment, and then how well you're able to adapt your environment is going to have an impact on how well you're able to do for yourself, how well you're able to succeed, and that will then influence how many children you're able to sort of produce, right? Because according to Charles Darwin and theory of evolution, that is the most primal of instincts, right, to sort of reproduce, right? Now, there are certain characteristics that have adaptive value, and what that does is that helps organisms survive, right? And because it helps organisms survive, that particular characteristic is more likely to be passed on to subsequent generations. Now, William James applied the same sort of thinking to consciousness, right? And the way that he reasoned was that, consciousness has survived, right? So in the evolution of the human race, right, we still have consciousness, right? So it has survived. That is a fact, right? And, its survival is evidence that it must have some survival value. It must have some adaptive value, because had it not had adaptive value, it would have become extinct. It would have, during the process of evolution, it would have been wiped out, right? So because it has survived, then it must have some adaptive value, right? Now, our job as psychologists is to find out what that adaptive value is. So then our job as psychologists is to find out what is the function of conscious experience, right? In the sense that what is its purpose, right? What sort of adaptive value is it serving, right? So this is how William James was reasoning when he said that the focus should be the function of conscious experience and not so much the structure, right? So till now, we've sort of moved from Wilhelm Wundt, who said that, who was of the opinion that psychology, he established psychology as a distinct discipline. He talked about how its subject matter ought to be conscious experience, but the structure of conscious experience. And then, we moved on to structuralism, which was a movement started off by Edward Titchener. And, again, he was studying the structure of conscious experience. And now we've come to William James. The subject matter is still conscious experience, but instead of being the structure of conscious experience, we are now looking at the function of conscious experience, right? Next, we move to this rather controversial gentleman by the name of Sigmund Freud. Now, Freud was a medical doctor, right? And what he saw was, in his medical practice, during the course of his medical practice, he saw a lot of people who had some sort of physical symptoms. And, very extreme physical symptoms, such as hysteria, such as, for example, that, they would find their body getting numb, or they would be experiencing a lot of pain, right? But when he would investigate, right, there would be no biological basis for those physical symptoms, Rather, what Sigmund Freud found was that these physical symptoms were caused by some sort of disturbances in these individuals' lives, some sort of, sort of dreams that they were having, some sort of thoughts that they were suppressing, some sorts of desires that they were trying to hide, right? So it was because of, something mental that these physical symptoms were manifesting themselves, right? And what Freud believed, and the way, and one of the reasons why he's so controversial, was because he believed that, till now we have been looking at how psychologists were focusing on conscious experience, right? So Freud basically, through his experience of clinical practice, right, what he said was that conscious experience does not matter at all, right? That should not be the subject matter of psychology, right? Rather, we should focus on the unconscious. That is what truly matters, right? Now, you might ask, what is the unconscious? So the unconscious is everything that is not in our awareness, right? So the unconscious might contain within itself different desires, right? Different memories, right? Different dreams, perhaps, different thoughts, or there might be feelings, right? So all of these are, something that we're not really aware of, or something that we have really suppressed, right? So if, for example, you have this very unpleasant memory, right, you might suppress it so much that it ceases to be part of your conscious experience, right? And it enters your unconscious. What Freud believed, rather, was that the unconscious, even though it's a storehouse of these desires, memories, and thoughts, and it's below the level of consciousness, it's below the level of awareness, so you're not aware that you have all of these thoughts, feelings, or different desires. However, right, the unconscious still exerts, according to Freud, the greatest influence. It exerts the greatest influence on our beings, right? So a lot of what you do, right, is influenced by whatever is there in your unconscious, right? Whatever it is that you're doing, whatever it is that you're thinking, a lot of it is influenced by your unconscious, right? A lot of your behavior, a lot of what you choose to do in life is governed by whatever is stored in your unconscious mind, right? Now, obviously, this is a thought which is not very comfortable, in the sense that Freud is suggesting that you are being ruled or influenced, if we use a less heavy word, by something that is not within your awareness, right? And that obviously is a somewhat uncomfortable thought, right? So this is basically what Freud believed, and then later he also developed his idea of the psychosexual stages, which is basically that he believes that every child till the years of 5, till actually even above 5, because now we have the latency and the genital stage as well. What they do is that they go through these different developmental stages, right, which are psychosexual in nature, right? So you have something like the oral stage, the anal stage, and that is something that we'll discuss in more detail in the chapter on personality. But what he believed was that the first 5 years of life, right, or the years of childhood, are extremely influential in shaping who you become as an adult, right? So there's this very famous quote by Freud in which he says that the child is the father of the man who will be, right? which basically means that, the child is influencing who you will be when you grow up, right? So this is basically, Freud's idea of what psychology ought to be. So what Freud does is that he moves the subject matter from being conscious experience to something completely different, and he moves it to the study of the unconscious, right? So this is what Freud does, right? Then we come to, we go back to the United States. So we had moved back to Europe with Freud, because Freud was based in Vienna, right? Now we move back to the United States when we consider the school of behaviorism, right? And behaviorism is something that was initiated as a movement within psychology by a gentleman by the name of J.B. Watson. Right, now J.B. Watson was a psychologist, right? But he believed that, rather than looking at conscious experience as, all of the other psychologists, whether they were structuralists or functionalists were looking at, or unconscious experience, right? It was important to study behavior, right? Now, according to J.B. Watson, because conscious experience is something that you cannot see, something that you cannot feel, right? Therefore, it should not be included in what is considered to be the scientific study of, the mind, or, psychology is supposed to be a scientific discipline now, right? So something that cannot be seen, that cannot be felt, ought not to be a topic of discussion. Rather, we should only look at behavior, and that to overt behavior, or behavior that can be observed, right? So J.B. Watson again shifted the focus from psychology being a study of the mind, and he, sort of refocused, he sort of brought it to, emphasizing on overt behavior. So J.B. Watson, what he believed was that psychology ought to be the scientific study of behavior, right? And, added to this, J.B. Watson was a huge proponent, right? He was very outspoken about how he believed that the environment played the largest part in the shaping of an individual. So, the way that an individual is just because of their environment. It's because of how their parents have, sort of treated them in their childhood. It's how their present environment is treating them. So there's this very famous quote by him in which he says that, if you give me a dozen healthy infants, I will make them at will. I will just choose one of them, make him an engineer according to the, sort of training that I would give him. I would pick anyone and make him a doctor. So he truly believed that rather than, certain characteristics being innate or something that you're born with, the environment is really the biggest influence in terms of who you become, right? So this is basically what J.B. Watson believed, right? Then, as behaviorism grew in the United States, we see another individual by the name of B.F. Skinner. Now, B.F. Skinner was also a behaviorist, right? But in a lot of ways, he was a lot more extreme in his ideas than J.B. Watson, right? And B.F. Skinner also believed that, we should do all sorts of research that we do in psychology that should, primarily be done with animals. Because what B.F. Skinner was getting at was that we should try to break down all sorts of behavior into stimulus response units. Now, what does this mean?